Welcome to Reddit's For Sleep, where every story is your escape into calm. If this video helps you relax or drift off tonight, gently tap that like button so we can keep making more just like this. And if you haven't already, subscribe and let us tuck you in with a fresh hour of stories every single night. Story 1. My husband told me to leave the ER, then called me heartless for actually leaving. So, I'm still turning this over in my head and honestly don't know if I'm in the wrong here. Last night my husband, let's call him Tom, and I ended up at the ER because he started having really bad stomach pain out of nowhere. One minute he was fine, watching TV with me, and the next he was doubled over, saying it felt like someone was stabbing him in the side. I freaked out and said we needed to get him checked out immediately. He's stubborn about doctors, but this time, he didn't argue. I drove him to the hospital, and they got him checked in pretty quickly. But after that, we waited. The ER was packed. There were people sitting on the floor, in the hallway, kids crying, nurses running around. Tom got a bed in the hallway, but they told us it might be hours before he could see a doctor, unless things got worse. I sat in one of those hard plastic chairs next to him, holding his hand, trying to keep him distracted. He was clearly in pain, shifting around and clenching his jaw. At some point, he looked over at me and said, "You should go home. There's no point in you sitting here already all night. I'll text you if anything happens." I told him I didn't mind staying. I even joked that I wasn't going to leave him to flirt with the nurses or anything. He smiled weakly and squeezed my hand, but said, "Seriously, go. You've been up since 6 a.m. You're exhausted. Just go home, get some sleep, and come back in the morning if I'm still here." I argued for a few minutes, but he kept insisting. So, I left. I went home, fed the dog, took a shower, and curled up on the couch with my phone in my hand. I kept it on loud so I wouldn't miss his call. About 2 hours later, I got a text. "I can't believe you actually left me here. Wow." My stomach dropped. I stared at the screen for a solid minute, trying to figure out if he was joking. I texted back asking if he was okay, and he replied, "Had surgery. Alone. Thanks for that." I grabbed my keys and drove straight back to the hospital, but by the time I got there, visiting hours were over. The nurse told me he was resting and I couldn't see him until morning. This morning I came back as soon as they let visitors in. He was sitting up in bed, looking tired and pale. I walked in, ready to apologize. But before I could say anything, he said, "Don't bother. You've made it clear how much you care." I tried to explain that I left because he told me to, that I thought I was respecting his wishes, but he cut me off and said, "A wife who actually loved me wouldn't have left, no matter what I said." I didn't know what to say to that. We've been together for 7 years, married for 4. I love him. I thought he knew that. I thought leaving the ER was what he wanted. Now I'm wondering if I failed some unspoken test. He's still giving me the cold shoulder. I'm sitting here on the porch writing this because I don't know how to make this right. Am I really that heartless? Or was I just doing what I thought he wanted? Story 2. My boss told me to stay in my lane, so I did. And it cost him his business. This happened a few years ago, but I still think about it every time I drive past my old office building. I used to work for a small logistics company. It wasn't fancy, just a handful of employees in a plain brick office building on the outskirts of town. I handled client accounts, scheduled deliveries, and basically made sure the whole operation didn't fall apart. My boss, Carl, not his real name, was one of those guys who thought he was a genius entrepreneur. In reality, he inherited the business from his dad and ran it like a high school group project. He spent most of his time golfing, bragging about his killer instincts, and taking 2-hour lunches while the rest of us scrambled to keep things running. At first, I didn't mind. The pay was decent, and I genuinely liked most of my coworkers. But over time, Carl became difficult. It started small. He'd forget to approve expense reports, leaving me to pay for client lunches out of pocket. He'd change my vacation schedule without notice, then act like I was the problem for not being flexible. But the worst part, he had a habit of dismissing my suggestions in meetings. "Stay in your lane," he'd say with that smug little smirk. "You're here to process invoices, not run the company." The thing is, I wasn't trying to run the company. I just wanted to fix obvious problems. For example, one of our biggest clients had complained multiple times about late shipments because Carl refused to update our outdated routing software. I brought it up 3 times in meetings, and each time he brushed me off. "Stay in your lane," he repeated. Fine. I stayed in my lane. A few months later, the client dropped us. They signed a contract with a competitor who promised more reliable service. That one account represented 40% of our revenue. Losing them sent Carl into a tailspin. He started blaming everyone but himself. He accused the drivers of slacking off, the warehouse manager of poor oversight, and me, of all people, of sabotaging the relationship with the client. At that point, I was done. I started quietly looking for another job and keeping detailed records of everything happening in the office. Emails, text messages, memos. I saved it all. Here's where the revenge comes in. One afternoon, Carl stormed into my office, holding a folder of invoices. "These are all wrong," he barked. "Fix them." I calmly explained that the invoices were correct and that he'd approved them himself 2 weeks prior. He didn't want to hear it. "You're incompetent," he snapped. "I should have fired you months ago." That was the moment I stopped caring about being professional. "Go ahead," I said evenly. "But if you fire me, you'll have to explain to the IRS why you've been classifying full-time employees as independent contractors for the past 3 years. Carl froze. "You don't know what you're talking about," he said, but his voice wasn't nearly as confident. "Oh, I do," I replied. "And so does my attorney." Carl didn't fire me. Instead, he tried to play nice for the next few weeks. But I wasn't interested in playing anymore. I handed in my resignation 2 months later, right after I'd secured a position at a much better company. On my last day, I sent an anonymous tip to the IRS about Carl's shady employee classifications and a few other questionable practices I'd documented. I also forwarded key evidence to the Department of Labor and our state's tax board. 6 months later, the company folded. The IRS hit Carl with massive fines for tax evasion, and he had to sell off most of his assets to cover the penalties. Last I heard, he's working as a consultant out of his garage and trying to pitch investors on a logistics startup that nobody wants to touch. As for me, I'm doing great. I work for a company that actually values my input, and I haven't heard the words, "stay in your lane," in years. Story 3. Today, I effed up by pretending to know my neighbor and getting invited to dinner. So this happened last weekend, and I still can't decide if I should laugh or crawl into a hole and never come out. There's a couple that lives 2 houses down from me. We've been neighbors for almost 3 years now, and while we're not close, we've exchanged plenty of waves. "How's it going?" conversations, and the occasional borrowed cup of sugar. The husband's name is Mark, the wife. I've been calling her Lisa in my head for as long as I can remember. She looks like a Lisa to me. Don't ask why. Here's where I effed up. Saturday morning, I was in my driveway wrestling with the world's most stubborn garden hose when they walked by with their golden retriever. "Hey, neighbor," Mark called out. "Hey, Mark." "Hey, Lisa," I said, waving. The wife smiled politely, but didn't correct me. "You should come by later," Mark said. "We're having a few people over for dinner." I panicked. I'm not a dinner party person. Small talk with strangers? No thank you. But before I could think of an excuse, my mouth betrayed me. Sure, sounds fun, I heard myself say. Fast forward to 6:30 p.m. I'm standing on their porch with a bottle of wine in one hand and a store-bought pie in the other, trying to remind myself how to be a functioning adult. Mark opened the door and ushered me in. The house smelled amazing. Roast chicken, garlic, fresh bread. The dining table was set with candles and fancy napkins. A handful of people I'd never seen before were already seated, laughing and drinking wine. And then Lisa walked in. Except her name isn't Lisa. Mark introduced her to everyone as Sarah. The room started spinning. This woman, who I've been confidently calling Lisa for 3 years, was smiling at me like everything was fine. I tried to act normal, but my brain was screaming, why didn't she correct me this morning? As dinner went on, I avoided saying her name at all costs. Could you pass the salt? Please? Wow, this bread is amazing. Did you bake it? Thank you so much for having me. Every time I almost slipped up and said Lisa, I choked on my own words like a nervous teenager at prom. After dessert, Sarah started clearing plates and Mark cornered me in the kitchen. You've been awfully quiet tonight, he said with a grin. Did we scare you off with all our politics talk? I laughed nervously. No, just taking it all in. Then, in a moment of bravery, or stupidity, I blurted out, by the way, I just realized I've been calling your wife Lisa for, 3 years. Mark blinked. Oh yeah, he said casually. We thought it was funny, so we never corrected you. What? I said, my voice an octave higher than intended. She looks like a Lisa, Mark said with a shrug. Don't worry, she thinks it's hilarious. On my way out, Sarah Lisa patted my arm and said, don't feel bad. I kind of like the nickname. I smiled, mumbled something about, see you later, and practically ran home. Now, every time I see them walking their dog, I wave and say, hey, Sarah. And she always responds with a mischievous smile and a cheerful, hi there, neighbor. But deep down, I know she'll always be Lisa to me. Story 4. The theme park manager told me to stick to my job. So I did. And it cost him his bonus. Years ago, I worked at a popular theme park. Not the big, mouse-eared one you're thinking of, but one of those mid-sized parks that families hit up in the summer when they can't afford the big trips. I was in my early 20s, fresh out of high school, and desperate for anything that paid more than minimum wage. Working at a theme park sounded fun. Rides, popcorn, happy kids. How bad could it be? I got assigned to the food and beverage department. My job was simple. Sling overpriced sodas and hot dogs to sweaty families. The uniforms were horrible. Bright yellow polos and khaki shorts that made me look like a human banana. But the tips were decent, and most of the time I could zone out and daydream while I worked. Our stand was across from one of the biggest roller coasters in the park. It wasn't uncommon for us to have a line of 20-plus people during lunch hours. The park manager, Rick, not his real name, was one of those guys who took himself way too seriously. He strutted around in his pressed polo and aviator sunglasses like he was running a Fortune 500 company instead of a summer amusement park. He was also obsessed with guest satisfaction scores. Every employee's performance was tied to these surveys guests filled out online. A bad score could ruin your week. One Saturday, we got slammed. It was hot, mid-90s, and the soda machines couldn't keep up. I was refilling the ice bin for the 4th time when I noticed a little boy standing near the trash can, crying. He couldn't have been more than 5 or 6, and he was clutching a stuffed animal like his life depended on it. I leaned over the counter. Hey, buddy, are you okay? I asked. He didn't answer. His cheeks were red and tear-streaked. Do you know where your parents are? He shook his head. I told my coworker I'd be right back, grabbed a bottle of water from the cooler, and walked around to kneel beside him. Here, I said, holding out the water. It's really hot today. Why don't you take a sip? He took it with trembling hands and gulped it down. Just then, Rick appeared out of nowhere. What are you doing? He barked. I stood up quickly. This little guy's lost. I was going to take him to guest services so they can find his parents. Rick scowled. It's not your job. Your food service. Stay at your station. But, no buts. If you leave, who's going to run the register? Take care of paying guests first. Someone else will handle the kid. I glanced around. No one else seemed to notice the boy. Shouldn't we at least call it in? I asked. Stay in your lane, Rick snapped. We've got procedures for this. Don't get involved. I nodded, biting my tongue. Understood, I said. So I went back to my stand. And I stayed there. I didn't call it in. I didn't walk the boy to guest services. I didn't even mention him again. I stayed in my lane. Rick walked off in his usual hurry, probably to yell at someone else for smiling too much or not sweeping popcorn fast enough. About 20 minutes later, I saw a woman running toward the trash can area, screaming her son's name. It was the little boy's mom. She collapsed onto her knees and hugged him like she thought she'd never see him again. She was sobbing so hard, I could hear her over the roar of the roller coaster. When she stood up, she spotted Rick striding toward her with his clipboard. You left my son alone for 20 minutes? She screamed. What kind of park is this? Rick tried to calm her down, but she wasn't having it. I want your name, she said, and your supervisor's name. You'll be hearing from me. The next week, corporate came down hard. The mom filed a formal complaint, and Rick's precious guest satisfaction scores tanked. His end-of-season bonus depended on those numbers. And because I'd done exactly what he told me, stayed in my lane, there was nothing he could pin on me. He glared at me every time he walked past after that. But he couldn't say a word. I kept my head down, sold my hot dogs, and smiled at every guest who came to my window. To this day, I can't hear the phrase, stay in your lane, without smirking. Story 5. I've been living with this secret for years, and I'm finally ready to say it out loud. I don't even know where to begin. For years, I carried something inside me that I never dared share with anyone. Not my spouse, not my closest friends, not even myself at times. Outwardly, I was the strong one, the dependable one, the person people turned to when their own worlds were falling apart. I was the steady hand, the listener, the one who offered advice and encouragement. I had this image carefully built around me, and I clung to it because it made me feel safe. But behind closed doors, I was crumbling. It started slowly, almost imperceptibly. A little fatigue here, a pang of sadness there. At first I told myself it was just stress. Work was busy, family life was hectic, and who wouldn't feel overwhelmed sometimes? But the feelings didn't go away. They grew heavier, like shadows creeping over my heart. I stopped answering calls from friends because I didn't have the energy to put on a happy face. I declined invitations, preferring the solitude of my quiet apartment over laughter and conversation. At work, I went through the motions. I met deadlines and answered emails, but my mind was elsewhere, clouded and distant. My spouse noticed, of course. One night, as we sat in the living room, they asked gently, "Are you okay? You seem tired lately." I smiled and nodded, brushing it off. Just tired, that's all. But it wasn't just tiredness. It was a heaviness that pressed down on me every morning when I woke up. A knot I couldn't untie. One afternoon, things came to a head. I was at the grocery store, standing in the checkout line, when suddenly I couldn't hold it anymore. The tears started to fall, quiet at first, then in a steady stream. I didn't want anyone to see, so I pulled my jacket tight around me and tried to steady my breathing. A kind stranger behind me handed me a tissue and said, "It's okay. Sometimes it just gets too much." That moment was both humiliating and freeing. For the first time, I realized I wasn't alone, and that maybe, just maybe, it was okay to ask for help. That night, I found myself searching online for therapists in my area. I bookmarked several, then deleted them, unsure if I was ready. Days passed, weeks. Finally, I made the call. The first appointment was nerve-wracking. I wasn't used to talking about myself, especially not my fears and vulnerabilities. But the therapist was patient and kind, creating a space where I felt safe to unravel the tightly wound thoughts in my head. Therapy wasn't a magic fix. It was slow, sometimes painful, and often exhausting. There were days I wanted to give up, to retreat back into my shell and pretend nothing had changed. But I kept going. I started opening up to my spouse more, sharing pieces of the darkness I'd been hiding. It wasn't easy. There were tears, awkward silences, and moments of doubt, but it brought us closer in ways I hadn't expected. I also began reaching out to friends, letting them know I wasn't always okay. I was surprised by their support. Texts, calls, invitations that I had felt strong enough to accept before. It reminded me that relationships are give and take, that being vulnerable doesn't make you weak, it makes you human. Now, years later, I'm still on this journey. Some days are bright, filled with laughter and hope. Others are darker, but I've learned to sit with those feelings without judgment. I'm not perfect, and I don't expect to be, but I'm honest, with myself and with the people I love. If you're listening and feeling overwhelmed, tired, or lost, I want you to know you're not alone. It's okay to not have all the answers. It's okay to ask for help. And it's okay to take things one day at a time. I'm sharing this here because keeping this secret locked away for so long almost broke me. But sharing it, even anonymously, feels like a small step toward healing. Maybe, somewhere out there, this helps someone else carry their burden a little easier tonight. Story 6. The time I stood up to my entitled in-laws and finally found my peace. I never imagined family could be the source of so much stress. Moving into our first home was supposed to be the start of a new chapter filled with joy and togetherness. Instead, it quickly turned into a test of patience and boundaries I didn't know I needed to set. When my husband and I bought our house, it was modest, but exactly what we wanted. A quiet neighborhood, a small yard for our dog, and space to start building our life together. We were both thrilled and full of hope. From the very beginning, though, his parents were persistent. They started dropping by without notice, sometimes multiple times a week. At first, I told myself maybe they just missed their son and wanted to spend time. I tried to be welcoming, even when I wasn't expecting them. One Sunday afternoon stands out clearly. I was in the middle of cleaning when the doorbell rang. It was them, my mother and father-in-law, carrying 3 huge bags of groceries. "We thought we'd help you stock the fridge," they said cheerfully. I thanked them, but as soon as they came in, they started unloading and rearranging everything without asking. They tossed some of my favorite sauces into the back of the pantry, and when I tried to suggest putting them back, I was gently brushed off. "I don't think you need all these spicy things," my mother-in-law said with a smile. "Your husband prefers simple meals anyway." It stung, even though I tried to hide it. That evening, I opened the fridge and found some of my homemade meals discarded or repackaged. When I asked about it, they said, "We just wanted to make sure he's eating right." I wanted to say something, but my husband just nodded and said, "Thanks, Mom and Dad." It's thoughtful. Over the next few weeks, the help kept coming unsolicited advice about what I cooked, how I cleaned, even how I dressed. You shouldn't let him eat so much takeout, my mother-in-law remarked once. It's not healthy. In another time, are you sure you're cooking enough? He looks a bit thin. I smiled through gritted teeth. One evening, during a dinner we'd invited them to, things came to a head. I had spent the whole day cooking a meal I thought everyone would enjoy. The table was set with candles, and I folded the napkins in a style I'd learned from a magazine. But as soon as my mother-in-law sat down, she frowned. "Is this really how you entertain guests?" she said loudly. "No wonder he's always tired." The comment hit me like a slap. I felt my throat tighten, my heart pounding. I was used to being polite, but that night, something inside me broke. I took a deep breath and spoke calmly, but firmly. "I appreciate you coming over, but I have to be honest, it feels like my efforts aren't recognized, and that hurts. This home should be a place of respect for everyone who lives here." My husband looked surprised, and I could tell he wasn't sure what to say. I continued. "If we want to have a healthy relationship, we need boundaries. I want to welcome you, but I need you to respect our space and our decisions." There was a long pause. My mother-in-law's eyes narrowed. "Well, if you think you know better than us, maybe you should do all the cooking yourself," she said, her tone sharp. I smiled softly. "Maybe I will." The air changed after that night. Visits became less frequent, and when they happened, they were more respectful. My husband finally began to stand up for me, and we started having honest conversations about what we wanted from our relationship with his family. It wasn't easy. Old habits die hard, and the tension lingered for a while. But bit by bit, things improved. I learned an important lesson. It's okay to speak up, even when it feels uncomfortable. It's okay to protect your peace. If you're struggling with entitled family members, remember that boundaries aren't about shutting people out. They're about creating a space where everyone can feel safe and respected. Now, when I think back to those early days, I'm proud of how far we've come. Our home is peaceful, and our family relationships are healthier than ever. Sometimes, I still hear my mother-in-law's voice echoing in my head, but instead of shrinking away, I remind myself that standing up for myself was the best gift I could give to our marriage. If you're listening and feeling overwhelmed by family drama, know that you're not alone. It's okay to put yourself first sometimes. It's okay to say no. Your peace is worth protecting. Story 7. How small acts of kindness helped me and my partner heal during a rough patch. Maya and I have been together for almost 6 years now. We met during our first year at university, two nervous freshmen thrown together by chance in an introductory literature class. It wasn't instant fireworks, but something quiet and steady grew between us, like a slow sunrise that warms everything it touches. Over the years, we shared so much moving into our first apartment, adopting a scruffy rescue dog named Charlie, late-night talks about dreams and fears. We were a team. But like any couple, we had our moments of struggle. Life can pile up quickly, demanding jobs, family responsibilities, the weight of expectations, and somewhere along the way, Maya and I found ourselves drifting, even while standing side by side. It started subtly. I noticed Maya would come home later than usual, shoulders heavy with stress, and instead of her usual smile, there was a quiet tension. Conversations grew shorter. Comfortable silences stretched longer. One evening, after a particularly grueling week at my job, managing a small bookstore, I found Maya curled up on the couch, scrolling through her phone with tired eyes. I wanted to reach out, but the words got stuck. So instead, I brewed 2 cups of her favorite chamomile tea, even though I'm not a tea drinker myself. I sat down next to her, handed her a cup, and said softly, "I'm here." She looked up, surprised, and then smiled a small, genuine smile that reminded me of why I loved her so much. That quiet moment was a turning point. We realized that we'd both been holding in so much stress, worries, fears, and that silence was growing between us like a shadow. We didn't have the energy for big conversations or grand gestures. What we could offer each other was simple: presence and kindness. Over the next weeks, we started leaving little notes for each other around the apartment. I'd find Maya's handwriting on sticky notes by the bathroom mirror. "You've got this," or "Don't forget to breathe." She'd discover my scrawled messages tucked inside her lunchbox. "Love you," or "One day at a time." We cooked more meals together, often with no recipe in mind, just chopping vegetables and laughing over our mistakes. Charlie, our dog, seemed to sense the change. His tail wagged more, and he'd curl up between us on the couch during our quiet evenings. One weekend, we decided to get away from the city noise and drive out to a nearby lake. We didn't plan much, just packed a picnic, some blankets, and let the day unfold. Sitting on the shore, skipping stones and watching the clouds drift lazily by, Maya turned to me and said, "I'm grateful for this for you." That simple sentence filled the space between us with warmth. From then on, we kept nurturing that connection with small, consistent kindnesses. We learned that love isn't about never facing hardship. It's about choosing to walk through those hardships together, hand in hand. If you're listening and feeling distant from someone you care about, maybe try this: small acts of kindness, gentle patience, and showing up even when it's hard. Sometimes, those quiet moments can become the strongest bridges. Story 8. How I outsmarted my rude coworker and finally got the last laugh. I've always been a quiet person, the kind who prefers to keep her head down and do her work without drawing too much attention. For the past few years, I worked at a small local marketing firm that specialized in digital campaigns for regional businesses. The team was tight-knit, with about a dozen people sharing the same open office space, which could be cozy, but sometimes a little claustrophobic. One of the people I worked most closely with was Dana. She had been with the company longer than me, and from day one, it was clear she had a reputation not the kind you'd want. Dana was known for being sharp-tongued, quick to criticize, and just generally unpleasant in subtle ways. She had a habit of cutting people off during meetings, making snide remarks under her breath, and forgetting to include others in important communications. Most of us tried to avoid confrontation with her because she could be intimidating when she wanted to be. She seemed to thrive on making others doubt themselves. I was no exception. I often left meetings feeling unsure of my ideas or second-guessing my work after Dana's comments. The real trouble started when we were assigned a major client campaign, one that could boost the company's profile significantly. I was thrilled to be put in charge of the creative side of things. It was a big responsibility, but I loved brainstorming and crafting concepts. I spent long nights researching the client's market, their competitors, and the kind of messaging that would work best. When I presented my initial ideas to the team, there was a lot of positive feedback except from Dana. She immediately jumped in with her critiques, mostly nitpicking and vague complaints that seemed designed to slow down the process rather than improve it. At first, I tried to explain my reasoning, but Dana would just talk over me or dismiss my points. The worst moment came right before the client presentation. Dana took it upon herself to rewrite large portions of the campaign materials, diluting the original concepts into something bland and forgettable. Then, at the meeting with the client, she presented the campaign as if it were all her own work, barely mentioning my name, even once. I sat quietly, frustrated and hurt, but I knew arguing there would only make me look unprofessional. That night, I felt like I was at a crossroads. I could either continue letting Dana walk all over me, or I could find a way to fight back without stooping to her level of petty drama. I decided on the latter. I began observing Dana more carefully. I noticed small things. She often left her computer unlocked when she stepped away for lunch or breaks. Her desk was cluttered with notes, coffee cups, and unfinished work, a chaotic reflection of her tendency to procrastinate. I also overheard conversations hinting that she frequently missed deadlines or submitted incomplete work, but somehow always managed to avoid consequences by shifting blame or distracting management with drama. So I developed a plan. I created a shared digital folder for all campaign assets concepts, presentations, timelines, and made sure every file was clearly dated and version controlled. I started sending polite, professional emails to Dana and the whole team, confirming deadlines and outlining who was responsible for each task. If Dana missed a deadline, I followed up with a gentle reminder copied to our manager. At first, she tried to ignore these emails or respond vaguely, but with every missed deadline or incomplete submission, there was now a clear paper trail, something that management could no longer overlook. I also began documenting meetings more thoroughly, taking notes and distributing minutes after each session, so there was no ambiguity about what had been discussed or decided. It wasn't about trying to catch Dana out. Exactly. It was about protecting myself and making the team's work transparent. Then came the big presentation day. Dana was responsible for presenting a key section of the campaign, one she had been tasked to finalize the night before. The afternoon before the meeting, I learned she hadn't completed her slides. She was scrambling, calling in favors, and clearly stressed. I took it upon myself to finish her section, using my notes and draft materials. I polished it carefully, making sure it fit seamlessly with the rest of the presentation. When the meeting started, Dana stumbled through her part. She was nervous, unprepared, and several times had to glance down at her notes for answers. But when my additions came up in the slides, the flow was smooth and professional, so much so that the client was visibly impressed. My manager later sent me a private message, thanking me for stepping up and calling my work exemplary and reliable. After that, things changed. Dana's usual tactics didn't work anymore. The team saw her missed deadlines and unprofessional behavior backed up by facts, not just whispers. She lost influence and respect in the office. I never said a word to her about the things I'd done. Instead, I kept working diligently, letting my results speak for themselves. In the end, that quiet persistence was my sweetest revenge. Sometimes, the best way to win isn't with confrontation or drama, but by staying professional, organized, and true to yourself. If you're dealing with a toxic coworker, know that you're not alone. Focus on your own integrity, document your work, and find subtle ways to protect yourself. Your reputation is your strongest weapon. Story 9. How losing my job unexpectedly led me to find myself again. For as long as I can remember, my job was more than just a way to pay the bills. It was who I was. Every morning, I dressed in my work clothes, stepped into my role as project manager at a small but ambitious tech startup, and felt like I was part of something meaningful. The deadlines, the brainstorming sessions, the late nights working on pitches, it all made me feel alive and purposeful. But life, as it often does, had other plans. It was a typical Tuesday afternoon when the news came. Our company, struggling to keep afloat amidst market shifts, was downsizing. Several teams were affected. My name was on the list. The meeting room was cold, and words felt distant. "We regret to inform you." I barely heard the rest. All I could think was, what now? The days that followed were a haze. I told myself I'd bounce back quickly, that I'd find another job, maybe even better. But reality hit harder than I expected. Every morning, I woke up without a purpose. I drifted through the day, filling the silence with TV shows or aimless scrolling on my phone. The rejection emails piled up polite, formulaic responses that cut deeper than I wanted to admit. I felt invisible, not just to the companies I applied to, but to myself. Who was I without this job? One particularly gray morning, I sat alone in a small cafe, nursing a lukewarm coffee. Nearby, two strangers laughed and shared stories about their hobbies: painting, hiking, a side business, selling handmade jewelry. Their joy was infectious. I realized how much I'd forgotten about the things that once made me happy, things I'd pushed aside to focus on work. That afternoon, I dusted off an old guitar sitting in my closet. The strings were stiff, and my fingers were clumsy. But as I strummed the first chords, something inside me shifted. For the first time in months, I smiled. I began to reclaim my life, piece by piece. I took long walks in the nearby park, breathing in the fresh air, watching the leaves fall. I journaled my thoughts and fears, sometimes messy and chaotic, sometimes hopeful and bright. I reconnected with friends, admitting my struggles and letting them in. Their kindness reminded me I wasn't alone. Slowly, I found part-time freelance work that allowed me the space to explore. The work was different, quieter, less intense, but it gave me time to heal. Looking back, losing my job felt like an ending, but it also opened a door I hadn't noticed before, a door to self-discovery. I'm learning to be gentle with myself, to find joy outside of productivity and titles. I'm learning that who I am isn't tied to a job. If you're listening and going through unexpected change or loss, know this: it's okay to feel lost and uncertain. But sometimes, the hardest times lead to the most beautiful beginnings. Story 10. How a loyal dog saved my friend's kids from danger and changed our lives forever. I want to share a story about my friend Lisa, her two young children, and their incredible dog, Max. It's a story about loyalty, bravery, and the quiet ways animals can protect us when we least expect it. Lisa and her family live in a peaceful suburban neighborhood, not far from the city, but surrounded by patches of woods and fields that make it feel like a little refuge. Lisa's children, Mia, who's 7, and Jamie, who's 5, have grown up playing outdoors, riding their bikes on the sidewalks and waving to neighbors as they pass by. Max, their golden retriever, has been part of the family since Mia was just a baby. He's a gentle giant with a calm temperament and an uncanny sense of when someone needs comfort or protection. One warm summer afternoon, the neighborhood was alive with the familiar sounds of children laughing, lawnmowers buzzing, and sprinklers spraying water in the hot sun. Lisa was inside the house, preparing dinner, but kept an ear out for her kids playing in the front yard. Mia and Jamie were chasing each other around the lawn, their small feet kicking up dust, while Max lay nearby in the shade of a large oak tree, his eyes half closed but alert. Suddenly, something changed. Max's ears twitched. His eyes snapped open. A low growl started in his throat, a sound unusual for him, quiet but serious. At the edge of the yard, partially hidden behind a bush, a wild coyote had crept closer than anyone expected. Coyotes in suburban areas are not unheard of, but they usually keep their distance from people. Max stood up slowly, his growl growing louder and more urgent. He positioned himself squarely between the kids and the coyote, his body tense and protective. Mia and Jamie stopped playing, their eyes wide with fear and confusion. They looked to Max, who gave a few sharp barks that echoed down the street, alerting neighbors to the danger. Lisa heard the barking from inside, and her heart raced as she rushed outside. She saw Max standing firm, barking fiercely at the coyote, who was now retreating slowly but keeping its eyes locked on the children. Lisa called out, "Max, get back! Come here!" But Max ignored her, focused entirely on shielding Mia and Jamie. The situation lasted only a few tense minutes, but it felt like hours. The coyote finally turned and disappeared back toward the woods at the end of the street. Max stayed close to the children, gently nudging them toward the safety of the porch. Lisa scooped up Jamie and Mia, tears welling in her eyes as she hugged them tightly. That night, the neighborhood gathered for an impromptu meeting. People shared stories of coyote sightings, concerns for their pets and children, and ideas for keeping everyone safe. But for Lisa's family, Max was the real hero. They showered him with extra treats, belly rubs, and affection for days after. Lisa even ordered a new leather collar for him, engraved with his name and a small tag that said, Guardian. Over the following weeks, Lisa noticed that Max seemed more vigilant than usual. He followed the kids more closely, slept by the door at night, and whenever a strange sound came from outside, he was the first to respond. He wasn't just a pet anymore. He was a protector, a guardian, watching over the family with quiet strength. The experience changed all of us who knew the family. It reminded us how much animals can do for us, often without us realizing. Max's bravery wasn't about fighting or aggression. It was about presence, loyalty, and a fierce love that drove him to stand between danger and those he cared about. If you have a loyal pet in your life, take a moment tonight to give them a little extra love. They watch over us in ways we might never fully understand. If you're still awake, thank you for spending your time with us. We'd love to have you back tomorrow night, so go ahead and subscribe. Tap like if this video helped you unwind. And let us know in the comments what kind of stories help you fall asleep. Sleep well. See you in the next one.